Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. I'm Katie Tyler, and we've got a guest today, Andrew Jones, who is a teacher, assistant principal, someone that can talk to us about sociology and the classics. So, first of all, I want to just say thank you for coming on today onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you, thank you. So, yeah, as I said in the brief introduction, that we're going to talk about teaching the classics within sociology. Before we get to that, is tell me a little bit about yourself and what brings you to the world of sociology.
I think I'm teaching sociology. It's an interesting one. I kind of went to school. I didn't do very well at school. I left school with two GCSEs. I went to an FE college, not knowing what I was going to do. All of my friends were doing A levels, and for some reason, the FE college let me do a load of GCSEs and the first year of an A level. So this was back in 1995, and I don't think anyone would do this anymore. And I had this brilliant teacher, Mr. Strange, who did do the odd thing that could be kind of similar or eponymous with his name in a way. He was really engaging. He made pots. He went on, I think it was ITN News, because he built a Meccano robot that was kind of saying down with Margaret Thatcher and things like that. But he was a really inspiring teacher, a really fantastic teacher. Loved the kind of theoretical side and would get very excited about things like Irving Goffman in our lessons. So that's how I came to sociology. Mr. Strange also taught me politics, and that's what I did in my degrees. I went off and did a degree in international relations, then theory and method, which some people might have found dry, as a master's degree. I thought that was fantastic. Then I ended up teaching in Thailand, came back, taught religious education, and then in my second school was told that I was teaching sociology, and realised that, no, this is fantastic, what an opportunity. And I've been doing that now for, I think that was 12 years ago. I've been teaching
Amazing.
sociology, and I think it's such a great subject. It's a really, really good subject. Completely biased, have a major rivalry with the government and politics teachers in the school. Really, I think this is the subject that properly gets to grips with how society works and its theoretical side.
Well, there we go. You've got a biased audience. I'm smiling from ear to ear, hearing those words. And that it is. I mean, it is a brilliant subject. I think I'm going to talk about the classics, but I think because of the contemporary nature of it, I think you can, like you said, get your teeth really into it. It's interesting because you've sort of had that sort of variety of a past in education of lots of different subjects, and there seems to be a common theme from the people we've spoken to on the podcast that they've either started off as PE teachers and have come through it that way, or psychology, which seems to be more common, or history teachers, but then have, like you said, fallen in love with the subject and actually really, really enjoy it. Also, interestingly, is that the teachers have this common thread of what's got them into sociology. It's this dynamic teacher, which really makes me think about something separate from what we're talking about today, but the importance of that teacher-student relationship and how that harvests a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for learning, irrespective of the content that needs to be delivered. And and it just seems to be this common thread every time I speak to someone that's is talking about sociology and their teaching and what's brought them there, is this dynamic teacher that's, I mean, it's quite interesting. Yours is called Mr. Strange. But yeah, those sort of personalities, let's just say that. So yeah, classics. I mean, I've gone and said, oh, we're going to talk about the classics, but what do you understand? What are you sort of classifying as the classics? Is it, where my head's thinking, it's your classical Marxist, functionists, interactionists, that sort of, that little group, the sort of founding fathers, the sociologists with beards, basically.
I think you start with those. So Durkheim, Weber, Marx. I think also as well, though, there's kind of more modern classics, a bit like you get literature and you get your modern classics books with Penguin and things. I would probably include in that Anne Oakley. I definitely include Irving Goffman, who's probably a favourite of mine, Paul Willis, Bowles and Gintis, Chubb and Moe. I'd even say Charles Murray as well. All of these things that I think when I was studying in the 1990s are still there in the textbooks. So they might not necessarily be sociologists from the 19th century, but they are those that I think have stood the test of time. And you couldn't really have an A-level syllabus without referencing them. So despite the fact that we do need kind of more contemporary studies, and I think one of the weaknesses perhaps in sociology is how do we get more kind of cutting edge research from academia into our teaching, particularly because teachers are busy, they're doing all these other things. But I think there are those people that go back to doing studies in the 80s and 90s. Stuart Hall's another example of someone I think we could say is classic. Stan Cohen, Albert Cohen, and of course, I'd say even Germaine Greer, not quite a sociologist, but always referenced, I think, by not only the textbooks, but probably most of the teachers who are teaching feminism, radical feminism, etc.
Yeah, so you talked about like your classics, i.e., I refer to them as the old men with beards, but the
Yeah.
sort of founding fathers of sociology, which, you know, whatever textbook you pick up, whether it's a new one or one that you sort of used in the 1990s, or those people that studied sociology in the 1970s, they're there. But you've also got these sort of modern classics that have tested the like test of time, basically, and they're still there. I sometimes refer to them as the value for money sociologists that, you know, to a student I always say, you know, you can always have them in your back pocket because I'm sure you could weave in Howard Becker somewhere or something like that, or Paul Willis, and shoehorn them into an essay, particularly across lots of different topics. You said that they're so important. Why then? Why are they so important? Why yes, it's important that you said to teach the contemporary stuff and that we have to keep abreast of the academia. It's getting that balance between bringing that in. But why is it still so important to teach the classics, do you think?
I think a lot of those ideas coming from those classics are still there. So obviously, you can see a thread. Paul Willis, for example, talks about Marx. Bowles and Gintis talk about Marx. And I think often people refer back to those studies as well. I'd say recently I've been doing quite a bit of study around something else I'm looking at in education. And I've been reading quite a lot of Stephen Bull. And Stephen Bull at the moment seems to be publishing quite a lot of papers on Foucault. Foucault is one of those people that we look at with crime and deviance, and I'd argue that's kind of a more contemporary classic. And Ball still feels it's important to talk about Foucault. Although we're going back 20 years, Becky Francis with Power Plays, which I think is a really underestimated book. That's the book where she talks about socialization, but how it impacts on children's play at school. And I think that's a great one to show the kids. And in that, again, she refers back to Foucault. So I think there are those certain studies out there that have impacted the way people think. I also think there are some that have clearly got resonance in current political thinking. So Charles Murray, for example, with the bell curve and what he says about the new rabble, and obviously the all-educated, etc. I think that's still relevant in a lot of our political discourse. So, of course, a contemporary politician might not refer to Charles Murray, but he is certainly there in his thinking on that. So I do think they're still relevant and they permeate everything we do. And I think if we were to read contemporary sociological papers, these people are still definitely being referenced in those. So I think it's important for the pupils to probably, or students rather, at A level, to have that understanding of the significance of these studies, because even if we were to segue in more kind of recent academic papers, they're still going to be referenced in those.
Funny because I actually had this conversation with the students the other day because they wanted to know the certain sociologists we studied from contemporary sociology and then sort of newer names that have been sort of released, depending on what exam board you're working from, but have released. And they was like, "Oh, what theory are they?" And I said that the complicated thing is they're probably a variety of theories, and they were, like you said, reference. They've been influenced, just like how you used a reference to music, and I was like, how like. I'm just digressing, but I was just like how each band. I think I was talking about Harry Styles. That's how I brought it in. That like what Harry Styles is doing isn't that new. It was obviously influenced by David Bowie. He was influenced probably by Mick Jagger. I'm not brilliant with my music history, but everyone's influenced by the next, and there'll be another Harry Styles who will be influenced by all of those as well. And I'm saying it's the same with contemporary sociologists, that actually if you read their original texts, they'll refer to, Louise Archer talks about Bourdieu a lot, Foucault as well. And so there's lots of reference to other sociologists. So I think, like you're saying, they're not in isolation. It's important to understand that. So then if it is so relevant and it is significant for us to understand them, well, not us, but also for us to really relay to our students, I suppose there's two questions I want to ask you. How do we embed that into our teaching without overloading our students? Because obviously want to keep it contemporary as well, but also how do we engage them? Because I sometimes will use the odd quote that maybe like I used Mead the other day for something. How do particularly the older classics rather than more contemporary classics as well. Some of it is a bit like a philosophy rather than like a sociology. So the way they're writing, you're sort of decoding that as well. So I suppose my two questions is how do we embed it without overloading the students? And then my second part to that question is how do we make it engaging when actually some of it can be a little bit more philosophy and the students find it sometimes hard to hook onto it. They're my two questions to you.
I think it's difficult for us as teachers because, first of all, if we're to find like little snippets that are engaging in these books, we have to read them. And I think some of them are dry. Social theory, I mean, having done a degree in social theory, I was at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. There's only 4 people doing our course because clearly people didn't want to read social theory. I think one of the ways to do it is one, look at those books that are important, that are mentioned in whether it's the Webb textbooks, the Chapman textbooks, that are clearly there and clearly examiners need to know. Because I think one of the dangers of bringing in lots of contemporary studies, maybe from 2020 or whatever, is that you do run the danger that some examiners might not be aware of them. And what I've done, I mean, I've got some examples here. I've kind of selected pages. So when I teach, for example, labelling, I think you can't really teach that without mentioning David Hargreaves, although it wasn't just David Hargreaves, it's Stephen Hester and Frank Miller. And I've got a copy of Deviance in Classrooms. And I don't want to do these guys a disservice because it's an amazing study, but it's one of the most boring books ever. Some sociological books, I think, can be quite fun. Paul Willis can be fun to read, but it's hard work because it's non-participant observations of classrooms, and it goes on and on and on. But there's literally one page. It's page 145, and in that page they mention the kind of 3 processes that you'd have in terms of labelling that we might teach from the other textbooks. So speculation, elaboration and stabilization, they're all on the same page. And I think you could kind of give that to the pupils, ask them to read through it, or the students rather, and identify 3 key words to describe the 3 areas that kind of lead to the label maybe being fixed or self-fulfilling prophecy. You mentioned Louise Archer as well earlier. I've got a copy of that book here, the Urban Youth and Schooling, which you can buy for like £3 on Amazon Marketplace or eBay. She actually wrote it with 2 other people, Sumi Hollingworth and Heaven Mendick. But the bit on Nike identities, which is probably the bit we all teach, that is no more than 2 pages in the book. And I think that can be given out as a homework. Kids can go home. And I think having a bit more time with those texts can actually kind of embed it a bit more. The Nike identities one's quite good as well because you've already got the hook with talking about Nike. I think kids can relate to that. Another example I've got here is, again, Bowles and Gintis. That is a very dry book, but the correspondence principle is explained very well on 2 pages. And I think there's sometimes as well the odd thing that can engage children, particularly in ethnographic studies. And I've got here Mac Angel's The Making of Men, Masculinity, Sexualities and Schooling. And again, you can buy a copy of this for about a £5 on eBay. And where it talks about academic achievers, macho lads, the new entrepreneurs, the real Englishmen, that's a bit longer. That's about 5 to 10 pages long in this book. But are you okay if I use a swear word?
I don't know. I thought we have not put it down as explicit, so maybe just say the
Okay, I won't use a
because
swear word.
yeah.
But I do this with learning to labour as well. Macho lads, for example, the little heading here, the 3 Fs, fighting, the word I won't mention, and football. But I remember doing English literature A level, and the teacher gave us notes language actually to understand accent and dialects, gave us the chapter from Trainspotting with a swear word about intercities. And we had to read that. And I remember being really engaged because it was so edgy and I didn't expect it from a teacher, having come from GCSE. And the kids do read this, and I think they are engaged by the fact that you've got an academic text that does talk about, one, it uses swear words. One, I think some of them probably recognise it from the playground and the corridors. And it's the same with Paul Willis. some of the transcripts he uses, because it's an ethnographic study, as we all know, some of those you do have to be careful what's said in those because it's not always very nice. But we are teaching an A level, and to give the kids some of the transcripts and to get them to look at those, Willis's theory side is again quite dry, but those transcripts can be quite enriching, and the kids can read them saying, "Yes, I now I understand what he's getting at with these boys, why they are completely, if you like, the antithesis to that middle school culture." So I think it's a case of finding the right bits. I mean, even with books that, like, I've got Barry Troner's book here on racism and education. That's quite good because he talks about the three S's, and that's only a paragraph. And even going back with Colin Lacey in Hightown Grammar, he does some kind of charts in that are quite good to pull out and discuss with the kids in terms of polarization. So I would never give the kids one of these books to go off and read like you would in philosophy A level. But to go through them, and it is a problem, I think, because it takes us a lot of time. But you do find 1 or 2 pages that can be really useful.
Yeah, so just selecting the bits appropriate for the students. I was thinking more as well, like I'm thinking about, because I know you've got an interest in pedagogy, and I was thinking about that in relation to that. What about sort of I'm looking at sort of a buzzword now, adaptive teaching. But for some of those texts, like we said, it's just 10 pages long. But if students are, I know we differentiate up and we adapt where possible, but for some schools, the breadth of ability is going to be quite wide. And obviously, we know sociology is very content heavy. Just from talking to teachers on our Facebook page, that it's sort of right to the end of the academic year where we're still teaching lots of the material. I suppose it's a bit of a loaded question more than anything, but how do we avoid running that risk then of getting too much depth and not enough breadth, but also maybe some of those students that may find some of that text quite hard, although you're saying it's a couple of pages. How do we avoid them just not doing that? Like, how do we make sure they access that appropriately?
I think, for example, going back to Mac and Gail, that would be a kind of extension homework if they wanted to do it. And I'm quite big on homework. I don't think homework should be a homework like that should not be the core homework. You set something shorter, something they can practice, something that, again, you're right, all of them can access. With 10 pages or so, that could be put in a reader that the kids get. They could read that if they are engaged with that idea. They could attempt it. I think with some of these texts, the Hargreaves book is really hard going. Like it is an academic tome. But I think with those 2 paragraphs, because it's so condensed where he talks about that, I think a lot of the kids can kind of pull out those words. You could do it in 2 ways as well. You could ask them to read through those, I think it's like 3 paragraphs, and pull out the 3 keywords you're looking for, or you could identify the keywords and ask the children to summarize it. Other books are actually, I think, written in a kinder way. I think the Louise Archer one's quite easy to follow. So I think it's a case of choosing it well, but only having a small snippet.
Yeah, a small
Yeah.
section.
Yes.
How do you interweave it in lesson time, other than obviously looking at just books? Is there any other ways you interweave the classics? Obviously, we've got the enrichment activities, we've got the reading the books. Is there any other ways in which you do that to sort of make it accessible to the students, other than just looking at sort of just the textbooks? Is there anything else that you sort of recommend that teachers are thinking about diversifying their curriculum?
I think first of all, sticking with the books is using pictures of the books, because you're completely right. Even if I give the kids a reader to do, a lot of them won't read those texts. I got through my A levels and probably my undergraduate degree with never actually go into a source text and just reading it from textbooks. So I do like to have big pictures of the books and the author. So it's a slide with no information on. It will have a picture of, so Irving Goffman with Asylums, a picture of the one of the Penguin editions, and a picture of Irving Goffman. And I think you're just flagging it up to them. Sometimes the covers can be really good as well. I think you can also find clips about some of these books. Stan Cohen, for example, teaching about the Mods and the Rockers and Moral Panics and Folk Devils. You've got obviously the classic texts that he wrote, but there's quite a few like small documentaries. There's things that teachers tutor to you do as well, where you can embed that where other people will talk about them as well. So I think that's one way to get them in. And obviously, the other thing I like to do as well is just say that these are books, these are things that we are learning about. They've been written, they've been around for a long time. And even if it's just holding a book in front of the kid, saying, that's what this was, I think then they're more likely to have a connection to that and remember it from that lesson, which can be quite good as well. The other thing I think people can occasionally do, although it is a risk because it can be a bit difficult for some pupils, is podcasts. Obviously, there's your podcast, but there's other podcasts out there which talk about the classic texts. I'd also say as well, thinking aloud with Laurie Taylor on the BBC. Occasionally, I'd use that for extension activities as well. There's also quirky ways around it as well. I think if you take Howard Becker, The Outsiders as well, that's written in the 1950s. But when I teach Howard Becker, it's a bit bizarre, but I stick a small YouTube clip of him in his jazz band, just because it's quirky. And I think the kids can then say, like, Howard Becker, the jazz player. Remember we watched him doing jazz? Maybe this isn't the best way to do it as well, but I try and talk about the people we're talking about in different ways as well. I always tell the kids that Karl Marx, for example, was quite a character. He lived in lots of different countries. He had to leave different countries. He was followed by lots of secret police. He got arrested for drunken disorderly behaviour on Tottenham Court Road. And hopefully then that will just trigger something else about that author that the kids can remember on that. So I think there's a number of different ways of doing that and different media you can bring in to kind of like, if you like, showcase the books.
Yeah, definitely. I know we had a couple of guests on talking about particular classical sociologists and how to introduce them. They do it's called, I think, the podcast Sociology of Everything. And again, theirs is only like 15, 20 minutes long. And it only deals with one concept. And I find that really useful. They had one on social facts that I gave my students to think about. And I think 15 minutes, students can access that in quite a nice soundbite. And yeah, like Laurie Taylor and Thinking Loud, again, use that for enrichment. And I think, like what you alluded to, that teaching the classics isn't just about giving those foundations to the students. It's also making them, like, I don't know, from what I was sensing, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's giving a purpose to sociology, so it gives them real people with real ideas who are human. That, I don't know, sometimes the students think they're just a name, but not like just a name, but with no person behind it. Obviously, they know there is a person behind it, but I think it gives that sort of reality to sociology, that it's just not this sort of theory that's just come out of nowhere, and it keeps it relatively contemporary as well. If you use more recent ones and say, well, actually they're still alive, or they work at like that university. So, like, for example, I mentioned whenever I teach Stephen Ball that when I was at the Institute of Education, I used to walk past his door and go like that. I did, like, he had his door closed, so I wasn't just like going like that, it's his door. I was like, oh my God, Stephen Ball, he's a real person. And just like you said, adding those little bits to the story makes it a little bit more real for those students, and it's about that engagement to the students. I personally have got on my door is the faces of a variety of different sociologists, from, you know, contemporary ones and recent ones, and then I've just got an empty box with a question mark saying, like, you, basically, to the students, just to, again, keep it real. I think, like you said, you know, just holding up the book or having a picture, or, you know, talking about, you know, jazz bands or whatever it might be, it makes it something that's tangible for the students to think about and go, oh my gosh, that's a real person. And I do the same as you, I must admit. I was talking about, for some reason, I went on a tangent about Althazar, and I was talking about how, like, it's probably not the most appropriate thing to be talking about, but how he killed his wife. But again, I know it's a bit of a
yeah, exactly.
I just mentioned it as a thing just because I wanted them to go, well, actually, they do all these theories, but actually they're also people as well. And so I think sometimes it's like, oh, really? Like, oh, like, I don't know. I think they sometimes are quite shocked that they're people with personalities, probably in the same way as they think that teachers don't leave their classrooms, potentially. And then when they see you in the supermarket, they're like, oh my gosh, you leave your classroom. I think it's sometimes the same with the sociologists they study as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also, with the bigger names out there, you can find a lot of YouTube clips. Like Stuart Hall's done a lot of things on TV. Paul Gilroy's always been interviewed for different things. I I've got Tony Swell recently as well in recent years. Even if it's not him, there's plenty of now news clips about some of his work, perhaps his more recent work as well. And I think we can find a lot of these big names being interviewed in lots of different ways. Obviously, I think some of the continental sociologists are a bit more difficult because they'll be speaking in French or German. But there's so many of them out there being interviewed that I think if we just wanted to maybe not even get the kids to engage with the text, but see a small clip of them talking about the books, that's quite easy to find, or just something that the kids might remember from seeing them.
Definitely. And I know that there's another podcast, the Sociology Show, and he does a lot of interviews with actual sort of obviously live living sociologists about their work. And I think they sort of, that again is really good, because I think that's like another thing we can signpost to students to as part of their enrichment as well. To sort of wrap it all round and sort of like bring it all to a sort of a general sort of point, have you got a particular favourite sociologist that you would say, yeah, that's the one? If you're going to spend some time on one sociologist for the students to understand, who's your sort of main sociologist that you think actually, if you need to go, like particularly people maybe like ITTs or ECTs, they may have read it part of their degree actually, to be fair, but is there anyone you think, or even like someone like myself who, I can't even remember when I did my degree, well, yeah, I do, 1998, but if I was to go back and read a book, who would you recommend if I was to read an original text again? I put the word if, like I'm like, I've got some of them up there, but I'm like, if I looked earlier and I was like, oh, I've got a couple of them. Some of them are given to students and never got back, but that's cool too. But yeah, I've got Toxic Childhood. That's not probably, I don't know if it's classic or not. I've got The Order of Things. That's quite a thick book to be reading. But is there a go-to? Do you think if you've got some summer holiday reading, you're laying on a beach, who would your go-to be?
It's interesting. I think for me, Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life is a book that I think about all the time. Reading it, I thought that's so true of me, of everyone I know. When I talk about Goffman with people and kind of wrap it up in a nutshell, they say, yeah, that theory sounds great. I have to be honest, though, it's not the most fun read. But I would probably say Goffman is there. Foucault is another one, Discipline and Punish. You mentioned The Order of Things. I think Discipline and Punish is a tone people are scared of because it's Foucault. And I think there's a reputation around Foucault saying, I can't, he's this kind of impenetrable French philosopher. I disagree with Discipline and Punish. I think, one, it's quite accessible, although you need to have be brave enough to attempt it. I would actually recommend people reading it on a Kindle because I think it's easier to read that way. And I think as well, it is so relevant now with kind of, again, surveillance. The other one, I read this for the first time this year, but I was really impressed with Anne Oakley's Housewife. And I don't know if I should say this on a podcast, but I read it quite a lot with my wife. And it did, again, make me kind of evaluate my relationship at home and some of the things Anne Oakley was saying about the nature of housework and the history of housework. I thought was really interesting. I've always used Oakley kind of from the textbooks, but reading it, I realized the work itself was so much more kind of rich, and she talks about industrialization, pre-industrialization. There was so much more in that book than I understood from Oakley. So I'd say that's a really, really good one as well.
So look, a couple there for holiday read. I did go for a phase. I think it's more when it's just like typical as a teacher. Sort of obviously did my degree, did lots of reading, did my master, did lots of reading, and then weirdly a long time ago, I sort of, when I first started teaching, I thought I need to have these texts in my house and I need to be able to read them and reference them. So I think I've got like you said, I feel like we're publicising different brands, but a well-known cheap second-hand place I bought something from, and I could just get a big box. It was literally a box that big of loads of original texts, and I did go through a couple of them and I did read them, and then I think the nature of the way that you get into teaching and learning, and then everything else sort of comes on and you think, oh, but actually as you're talking I'm like, do you know what, I might read one of these in the holidays. I don't know which one. I read Housewives a long time ago because it just had a really plain front cover, doesn't it? It just literally has Housewife on it. but maybe revisit it, particularly with hindsight, because obviously, think how have things changed? Have they not changed? That might be quite an interesting comparison to contemporary society. But yeah, I think there's lots to be done, and obviously it's also time to relax in the holidays as well. But yeah, I think sometimes
Yeah.
we read things secondhand in the textbooks, which is great, but it is nice to sort of revisit some of the originals and the classics as well. And I suppose that's role modelling to our students, isn't it, as well? And I have said to the students, I don't know if you've said the same, but that might be something they have to do as part of their degree if they're thinking of taking sociology. So I'm assuming, like I'm no referencing your point that you
Yeah.
read a lot from textbooks, but there's increasingly there's sort of a need to go back to those. Yeah.
And I think what you just said there with being role models is important. It's going back to Mr. Strange, my fantastic teacher from the mid-90s. He, I think, more than anything else, seemed to know these books, and I felt he'd read them. And although I didn't pick them up and read them then, and I don't think I would have understood half of them in full, as you were saying earlier, I think we need to be wise in the sections, and even if it's just a paragraph we select. But he certainly got passionate about these books. I was also going to say as well, like, I think one of the problems is where do you get them from? And I've got a massive shelf. I've taken old library shelves from the school library here to put them all in. Again, you can buy them on like secondhand book websites and things like that and find them. The other thing is, a lot of them now are post copyright, and you can get PDFs of a lot of the classics. Some of the contemporary classics as well through universities, you can find PDFs as well. So I think they're quite easy to find.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I did have a whole load of them at one point, but I gave them out to students, and I think I've got. Well, the only one that seems to have come back to me is Schooling in Capitalist America. That and Toxic Childhood are the only ones I think I've got left. I think. Oh, and the Communist Manifesto as well. So that never got. Because certain books got taken away, which is fine because that's part of the nature of lending out books. You potentially might not get them back. But yes, it's interesting chat. It made me exciting just talking to you about it. It sort of reminded me about the importance of the classics and maybe reading those original texts as well. Just before you go, do you want to make a quick plug to your website?
Yeah, I have a website. It's www.mrjoneswhiteboard.blog. It has a number of different things to do with kind of pedagogy, teaching, and learning. There are quite a few sociology um, blogs there. And if I may, I'm not plugging it because it's old now and there's a lot of redundant teaching methods in it. But I wrote a book on teaching sociology some time ago. And on that, I had a chapter on how you can use social theory as pedagogy. So, what would a Marxist pedagogy look like? What would a functionist pedagogy look like? What would a feminist one, a postmodern one look like? And I've kind of repurposed some of those chapters on that blog as well.
Okay, I'm
I,
interested by that. I thought that was a conversation in itself. I'm intrigued what a Marxist pedagogy would look like. I thought, could you say that in a nutshell, what that might look like?
It's critical pedagogy. I think it's Paulo Freire. It's teaching children to question, to be critical, and then obviously the philosophers have only talked about the why. The point is to change it. I'm paraphrasing there, but it would be that. I actually think the functionalist one's quite good as well. I mean, a functionalist pedagogy would be very much we need to teach the core skills and things needed for the division of labour. I think that's very much what schools do anyway. So I think it's a fascinating area. And I know we're running out of time, but one of the things I've got a bee in my bonnet about at the moment is education's become probably pedagogy as a whole has become a lot more defined now than it ever has been, a lot more evidence informed, which is a good thing. But it's all based on cognitive science and cognitive psychology. I don't have a problem with that. I think there's a lot of evidence and we should use those ideas. But what seems to be missing is the sociological side. Ofsted will talk about cultural capital. They've got no idea where the theoretical element came from. Yeah, I've heard politicians talk about social capital, but they've got no. Alex Quidley now talks about vocabulary, but it's all based on Basil Bernstein, really. So I don't know. I think there's so much out there that we could be bringing into teacher training that is based on social theory and social
Mm.
research in sociological terms. But unfortunately, the paradigm is cognitive science.
Interesting. I was talking about this the other day about the importance, and I think going back full circle to what you just said, right at the beginning about Mr. Strange. I was going to say Doctor Strange there, but Mr. Strange,
Yeah,
Mr. Strange. And going back to that importance of the teacher-student relationship and how those micro interactions have a really important part. So because I talk that a lot about sociology and the sociology of education, how important it is, and I've never really thought of it like as a like how you've just explained it, that we've changed that shift of teaching and learning. That's really got me to think, because I do mention it a lot about the stuff that sociologists have said, and all the research has been put behind the education and pedagogy. And I should remember that. That's what I did my master's in, and I've sort of neglected that. I've been swept with the current move in education, and need to get back to my roots on that as well. So thank you. I feel like that's a conversation in itself. That's like a different conversation as well. So maybe in the future, if you don't mind coming back, because that's something I'm really, really interested about personally as well, to sort of revisit that, how sociology can inform pedagogy. I think that's definitely something that I'm personally interested in. I'm sure lots of our listeners will be as well. So, but thank you for your time. Enjoy the summer holidays, and I look forward. I'm now thinking I might not read a classic as a classic now. I'm thinking I might read a classic on sociology and pedagogy, and going back to sort of my days studying that. So yeah, that sounds interesting. Thank you. Thank you for the refresher.
brilliant. No
Take care and
worries.
have a thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That's all right. Bye bye.